How's it going, everybody? I want to welcome you to the beginning of our VMware NSX-T series. We're going to be focusing on NSX-T 3.1, which is not the newest release and not even the second to newest release. For those of you that are out there that have been keeping up with the world of VMware, NSX4 actually just dropped 2 weeks ago, I think, maybe, depending on when you watch this video. So NSX4 is out now. NSX-T 3.2 was the release prior to that, which was a few months ago. I'm going to be working on 3.1 is the version of code we're going to be playing around with, the full edition. So this is not going to be the limited export version you would get if you go the VMware Users Group or VMUG Advantage licensing. I actually do have access to that as well, and I'm going to be using a bunch of additional technologies outside of NSX in order to play around with these technologies. We're going to be deploying this on ESXi 6.7, and we're going to go through an upgrade process. But before I get into any of that, let's talk about what we're going to be covering in this series. Because I've been working on, and this diagram, I'll link, I'll have it as a download for those of you. I was trying to figure out a good way to do diagrams, especially in VMware, that would be relatable. And it's hard outside of Eve to export it, so I had to come up with, and these diagrams took me a bit to build. It was a couple days. So, but this is basically the lab that I'm going to be building with you guys. So this diagram here, I will be walking you guys through every step of the way from basically a blank physical ESXi host running a Cisco UCS C220M3. I'll be walking you through the entire process of how to build this lab, so you can test out not only the data center world, so data center virtualization, but you'll also be able to play around with NSX-T. You'll also be able to, if you want to go that route, do VMware Horizon or their VDI solution. Now, I haven't gotten that far yet with my labbing, so I don't know what the capabilities are needed for that, but I have tested this lab out in my home lab. I'm basically going to be showing you guys how to build that. Now, I've actually got two different servers running today. One's on a Dell RA10, the one that I did a video on a while back. So I'm taking that, and that's actually my lab platform. And I'm using that specific server and that specific build out to do a lot of the demos I do for customers and to test a lot of features out for customers. So that's my customer lab environment. This environment that I'm building out is just another server that I have available in my home rack that you guys are going to be able to build out with me. Now, I know the other question is going to be, well, what if we don't have a server to build this out on? I don't know what the capabilities are going to be available to you if you go to a cloud platform like Azure, AWS, or GCP. I don't know. I don't ever work with them. I am not a personal believer in using cloud platforms for home labs. It's just my personal opinion on that. To me, I'd rather go buy a physical server, have it shipped to my house. I can then work on getting whatever operating system and capabilities running out that I need to. So that is my view on it. If you don't agree with that, that's completely okay. So what I'm going to walk you guys through is from the top down what we're going to be building and how we're going to build it out. So what you'll need to do, what you'll need to have, the resources that you'll be using, all that good stuff. And then I have an ESXi host available right here to show you the behind the scenes of what we're going to be doing. Again, this is a blank server. There's stuff available to it if I wanted to have it available, but right now there's nothing running on the server, nothing at all. And I am running vSphere 7 on it, so eventually I will be upgrading vSphere to vSphere 7 to talk about that, and we'll talk about how if you have a 6.7 environment, this won't be included in this initial set of videos, but it'll be more of an upgrade process. Let's say you want to upgrade from 6.7 to 7.0. Well, I'll explain to you what those requirements are because I've worked with a few clients that they've had to go the ESXi upgrade route in order to facilitate an NSX deployment and why they had to do that. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and minimize this screen for the moment, and we're going to talk about what the lab is going to look like. So again, the one thing that I want to preface here is that this is what I've built, and I've gone through the build several times. But this time here, I thought about it. As a matter of fact, whether you can fast forward through this portion if you want to or not. I was actually out of town on a mini weekend vacation with the family, and I was out on the boat, and we have a pontoon boat that my in-laws have, and so I was sitting on the boat waiting for my turn to go out on the wave runner, and I was sitting back, and I was in my own head, right? I'm sitting there thinking, not really paying attention to what's going on around me. I'm like, how would I do? Because I had a big NSX deployment coming up, and I had to, like, how would I roll that out? Plus, I also want to go tackle the VCIX for network virtualization, the design and the deploy exam. So I needed a good platform to, and I'll actually show you what I'm doing here. I'm going to share this with you as well. This came my spreadsheet of all the things that I've know how to do with NSX-T. I'll be walking, basically taking all of these topics, and eventually at some point in the future, going through and getting all this stuff up. So I'm pretty much going to be stopping at this point here with the initial set of labs. It's just going to be getting NSX-T up and running to do basic routing. If you wanted to migrate from traditional vCenter networking with distributed switches over to an NSX deployment, I'm going to show you guys how to basically get that. That'll be the first set of videos that I release. So, but this is basically my what have I tested out, what do I know how to do, that type of stuff is my, it's my sanity check on my level of understanding with NSX. So from the top down, so the top of this diagram down to the bottom of the diagram is going to be all, is going to be starting off with the physical side, and then anything inside this big rectangle here is going to be physical. It's going to be sitting on the physical server, and I'll be walking you through essentially what all these things are in order for you to understand what they come into play. So my switch, it happens to be a 3750X Cisco layer 3 switch, and it's my core router, or my core switch. Northbound of it, I've got a connection going to an ASA 5520, which terminates my internet. So that's basically what I have there. So this interface right here, I don't have it labeled here. It's just any gigabit interface on your switch that you want to use. So the interface that comes from the switch down to the host has to be a trunk port in order for you to support tagging, which we're going to do. I have vSwitch 0, right? This is the first the vSwitch that gets deployed or created when you first install any version of ESXi, and then the VM network port group gets built as well, and that's where by default all of your VM networking gets attached to. So what I did is I created a couple of additional port groups, CSR uplinks VLAN 20 and CSR uplinks VLAN 21, and these port groups are attached to vSwitch 0. So think of these guys right here. This is basically going to be VLAN 1, and then we have CSR uplinks VLAN 20 and VLAN 21. These are additional port groups with a single VLAN attached to it, and they are attached to vSwitch 0. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me the ability of taking a couple of CSR 1000Vs, 16.6 code, so we get a megabit of bandwidth. I thought about doing Nexus 9Ks to get a little bit more throughput. I think you can get like 5 or 6 megs down and a couple megs up for your bidirectional communications using Nexus, but I decided not to go that route only because of the fact that it doesn't really gain me anything. So I decided to stay with the CSR 1000V. So this right here will be, this is vSwitch 0 connects the outside world to the virtual side. And then we're going to have a couple CSR 1000Vs that we're going to deploy to act as our default gateway. And not pictured here, but basically we're going to double up and we're going to use both of these devices here as HSRP gateways. So I'll configure HSRP for every one of the networks that we're going to build down here that need to get out to the internet. So basically our Linux and Windows VMs that we're going to be building here, traditional vCenter networking. So we're going to have a series of VMs that we're going to be building out and stuff like that. So we're going to have the two CSRs that we're going to roll out, and then I'm also going to have a Server 2016 as our domain controller. That's going to have 2 network adapters on it as well. One adapter is going to be ETH0, which is going to be put into my VM network, which is going to allow me to RDP into this host, this virtual machine sitting on this host. And what that's basically going to allow us to do is connect into the rest of our environment. This is going to be a jump box, essentially. So if you were wondering what that would basically equate to, this is going to be our jump box for the rest of the environment. It's going to have an IP address on the management network. The management network is going to be everything 172.1.1.0/24. Every device that needs to be managed inside of VLAN 1 is going to be managed that way. Now I'm going to be creating another vSwitch. We're going to call it the lab vSwitch. And the lab vSwitch is not going to have any adapters attached, no VM network adapters. So not VMKs, not VM kernel adapters, no VM NICs. There's going to be no VM network adapters attached to it, so physical adapters. So it will not be able to talk to the outside world, which means that in order for any networking that sits inside of these ESXi hosts, they will have to go through the CSR1000V as their default gateway, and the CSR1000Vs will have an OSPF adjacency to my 3750X switch northbound of it. We'll run OSPF between these guys, and we'll be able to get connectivity up and running, and all that good stuff that goes along with that. I'm also going to run a connection between the routers, only because of the fact that if we need to fail over, we'll be able to bypass if there's an uplink issue. But that's assuming that this is my way of doing HA, right? So if there was a physical connectivity issue and you actually had like some routers terminating your data center, for example, or some ASR 1000, ASR 1002s, or some HX box, or maybe some Nexus 9Ks, you'd be able to do an HA connection northbound. So in case there's a physical uplink issue, that's just how my brain works. So this thing, I was like, I'm just going to throw 2 CSRs in there. It'll also give us the ability of playing around with a gateway redundancy protocol in our environment. So Lab vSwitch is not going to have any physical adapters to it. It's going to have no uplinks. And I'm going to create one port group on it called Lab Port Group. And that Lab Port Group is going to be a trunk. It's going to be tagged with VLAN 4095. VLAN 4095 is basically going to allow this port group with the promiscuous mode on, MAC address changes turned on, and forged transmits turned on to allow all communication between all of our devices to work. Now, what that basically means is any of the VMs that are going to be running inside these ESXi hosts, they will have to be placed into a VLAN that is also devices will elsewhere attached to this particular port group will also be in. That's why I have the networking set up the way that I do. So basically VLAN 100 and VLAN 101 will be our connectivity to, I'll have .1Q sub interfaces configured on gig 2 on both CSR1 and CSR2 in order for us to provide a gateway connection to the outside world. So both our Windows and Linux VMs will have access to the internet. It will be slow. It's a lab. I really don't care about performance. So that's basically how that comes into play. We'll have the Windows box over here. He will provide us a connection from the outside world in. So I'll be able to RDP in from to this IP address, and then this will also be our DNS server for the entire environment. So if we want to do any DNS, this is basically where we're going to go. Now, as we get into this more in detail, let me go ahead and zoom in just a little bit for you and scoot down. Every one of these ESXi hosts is going to have a series of network adapters attached to it. So there's 2 different ways that you can solve the virtual networking scenarios when it comes to VMware. You can either figure out how many different services that a particular ESXi host is going to have to provide to the virtual machines running on it, whether it's 2 for management, 2 for storage, a couple for vMotion, a couple for data, a couple for fault tolerance, a couple for whatever else you might want to throw in there. There's that. So you can provide and then team them together at the VDS level, the VMware Distributed Switch, and do something like that. Or you can have just a couple of uplinks and have them bundled together and connected to the upstream device, whatever it might be, and then trunk it and then have just a bunch of port groups married to that particular vSwitch and go that way. One way is not better than the other. Now, because of the fact that I'm dealing with a nested environment, which means we're going to be installing ESXi inside of ESXi. Yes, it's possible. We're going to have to do a couple of things in order to make this happen. The first thing we're going to have to do is when we deploy any ESXi hosts, we're going to have to go underneath the CPU controls and enable hardware-assisted virtualization. That's going to basically allow this ESXi host to allow any of the virtual machines that are going to be running inside of this host to basically punch through the host and see the underlying CPU of the physical server that it's residing on, which happens to be a Intel Xeon E5 2650. That's what the server, each one of these ESXi hosts is going to be getting. They're going to see the underlying CPU of the physical host. That's what they're going to see. Same thing with the jump box. That CPU will also be the same thing. We're going to give each of our hosts 16 gigs of RAM, a 40 gig hard drive that's been thin provisioned, and we're going to take the first two NICs, VMNIC 0 and VMNIC 1, and we're going to map them to an IP address per box in order for everything to work out the way that we need it to. I'm going to be rolling out a total of 6 ESXi hosts for our lab. Now, before I go any further as to the specifics for NSX, let me briefly talk about why I'm doing what I'm doing. In order for us to work with NSX effectively, we need to have a fully built out data center virtualization deployment. So we're going to have to deploy all these hosts, and we're also going to roll out storage right here. So I'm going to build out, basically it's not OpenFiler, it's FreeNAS. I'm going to be deploying FreeNAS with a 400 gig hard drive, which is going to basically allow us to do iSCSI. We're going to configure all the ESXi hosts to have a iSCSI connection. We're actually going to build, I'm going to have one that's 300 and one that's 100 gigs, just so we can have, or maybe I might split it down to two 200 gig hard drives. The actual breakdown of the 400 is irrelevant at this point in time, but ESXi 1, 2, and 3 will be inside of a cluster, so will ESXi 4. So we're going to have to build out all the data center stuff. So a lot of the stuff that you've already seen me do for data center virtualization, we're going to be walking through again, because you have to do it one way or the other. But it also requires any NSX engineer that's going to be deploying NSX to also understand the concepts of vMotion, storage, affinity groups, things like that that'll come into play. So we'll have to understand how all those come into play, and I'll talk about those in more detail when we get to those particular areas, just so that they're video-specific recommendations. If you're deploying your VDS, what are some of the good recommendations for that? So that's going to be some of the stuff that we're going to have to take a look at and do. Now, once we get this fully built out, we have our ESXi hosts built out, we have them deployed, and then we're going to join them to vCenter. Not pictured here, but we're going to have to roll out vCenter server, join all of our hosts to vCenter server, and all that good stuff. Once we have our ESXi hosts joined to vCenter, we're going to put ESXi 1, 2, and 3 into a cluster. And when we deploy NSX-T, in NSX-V, you had to deploy NSX at the cluster level. And any hosts that were joined to that cluster automatically inherited all the NSX VIBs that were getting pushed. NSX-T allows you to install per host if you need to do so. So if you've only got one host in a cluster, or maybe you got two, but you've only done, maybe you've only upgraded one to 6.7, the other one's still sitting at 6.5, for example. Well, what you'd be able to do is do an individual install on the host that's NSX supported. So we'll be going through and doing that. So 1, 2, and 3 will be in a cluster by itself. So there'll be a 3-node cluster, and then ESXi 4 will be a single cluster. But when we install NSX, we're going to install NSX at the host level for this host, but at the cluster level for these 3 hosts. So you can see what that looks like. And we're also going to do upgrades. We're going to upgrade from ESXi Update 1 to Update 3. I'm going to show you guys how to do that through vSphere Update Manager. And we're going to go through and we'll do at the host level for 1, and then at the cluster level for 1, 2, and 3. We're going to set up networking so that we can do the storage array. We can have storage across the board. And one of the caveats with a cluster is you must have a minimum of 2 data stores in order for data store heartbeating to work for distributed resource scheduling. So DRS has some rules that require that for doing the HA, especially when you do vSphere HA. That is a requirement. So we're going to go through and get all that squared away. 5 and 6 are going to be dedicated edge devices. So we're going to have basically a cluster of 2 ESXi hosts that are going to be handling our edge clusters. So our edge nodes that are going to be bridging, or I should say, being the gateway, if you will, or the border between our NSX environment and the outside world. So these guys right here won't get installed with NSX-T. They'll just have the NSX-T edge VM, the edge node, deployed to it. We're going to deploy 1 node per box We're going to set up an anti-affinity rule to where you will never get two edge nodes on the same host. So we'll not allow them to be at the same, and we'll set up vMotion to allow that to happen. So you would be able to vMotion from one node from say 5 to 6, but we're going to put an anti-affinity rule in place that says don't allow edge node 1 and edge node 2 to sit on 5 or 6 at the same time. Because if the physical host goes down, so do your edge nodes. It's a bad day. So we're going to get through all that. And then once all that's done, we'll be in good shape to really get into the nitty-gritty details of how all this stuff works. So this right here, this is going to be one of many diagrams that I walk you through. But essentially, this is what we're going to be building out and getting up and running. So it's going to be a lot of individual steps. I'd say there's probably going to be 10, maybe 15 videos that we have to record that go through the entire process of getting everything up and running. And then, which I guess you could call that the lab build. I always struggle when I decide to define a set of videos as lab build. So I might just do that first, where we have to build. I might do the data center build, right? So we focus on data center specific implementations, because up until we get vCenter deployed, we have all of our ESXi hosts going, we have all of our networking squared away, all that type of stuff. Up until that point, we wouldn't have touched NSX at all. We could deploy it beforehand if we wanted to, but we're not going to. One of the other things that I forgot to mention was the reason why we need this jump box is because this jump box right here, is going to have a network adapter connecting to us to the physical host, as well as a network adapter connecting to all of our nested hosts and our storage array and vCenter server and NSX-T manager and any of the additional devices we're going to be deploying. Now, for clarity's sake, not described here, everything, so these hosts right here, all these guys right here, these guys are going to be running in a nested environment. When you see them deployed, though, inside of this right here, when you see them rolled out here, they will all show up as one list of virtual machines. That's why I have this laid out the way that I do, because the storage array is going to be laid out, which you don't have to have vCenter in order to do vMotion. So, technically speaking, you could do poor man's vMotion. So you can do shared storage between a bunch of ESXi hosts and not require a vCenter. If you wanted to do vMotion to do it automated or to right click and say migrate, you do need vCenter for that. But if you had a VM that you say wanted to power down, say you wanted to do maintenance on a host, for example, you could power down a virtual machine, unregister from one host, and as long as those two hosts share the storage between each other and that virtual machine's files sit on the shared storage array, so this guy right here, you can go through and unregister a VM from one host and re-register to another host, answer a quick question of whether you moved it or copied it, and then power it up on another host. I have done that a few times with very small customers that don't have vCenter deployed, but they have a few hosts deployed, and they need to do some maintenance, whether it's a host upgrade, a patch, whatever it might be. So there's a couple different ways to handle that. I'm not going to walk you through all the little ways of doing it. My goal is to get all the storage built, everything up and running before we dive into vCenter. vCenter will happen after this is all built out, and I'll show you guys how to do a handful of hosts. We'll do the first 3 inside just regular ESXi networking. I'll show you guys how to do that. My goal is to do like an example of one particular, whatever the topic is in a video, walk you through step by step everything that's going on, and then I'll do like a fast forward section where I'll do the same thing on another couple hosts, but I'll speed the process up so you're not watching me do the same clicks 3 different times. So once that's done, we'll have all that. So this guy right here, we're going to be downloading a bunch of operating systems, ISO files, OVAs to this virtual machine, and that will allow us to take from my physical environment. I've got a bunch of OVAs and ISO files that I'm going to be copying to him, because once we do that, the lab, all of our devices, all of our ESXi hosts, vCenter server, NSX manager, our storage array, any of the advanced capabilities we deploy, like vRealize Network Insight, vRealize Log Insight, Operations Manager, all those additional VMs I said Verni, I said Log Insight, VROps. All of those additional devices will have their network adapters attached to this port group. This port group doesn't have any communication with the outside world. So the only way for me to deploy vCenter, NSX Manager, VROPS, vRealize Network Insight, etc., Verni, vRealize Log Insight, in order for all those technologies to get deployed, I have to have a way to talk to this port group. And the way that I do that is through this jump box. I will connect it into him, and then I will copy all those files to this virtual machine, and then I will deploy from this virtual machine via an RDP session and deploy. It'll actually get installed on this host. So it'll all get deployed right here in this virtual machine. You'll see a whole list of virtual machines that we're going to get deployed. But because of the fact that their network adapter are going to be on a port group, this port group right here, that doesn't have any uplinks to the physical network, we need a way of basically proxying for all that communication. And that's where this jump box is going to come in handy for us. So we're going to go through all of that and get everything up and running the way we need to. I've got all the networking notated over here for what we're going to be doing. And I'll be walking you through how we're going to get that all up and running. I'll walk you through step by step through it. So I'm actually going to, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm probably going to call it the data center lab build. And then I'm going to do the NSX lab build, because there's going to be a number of individual, the deployment part of individual things that we're going to have to deploy in order for NSX to work. So to get that all squared away, to the initially standing it up, and then once we have it stood up, then I'll be able to walk you through, for example, how do you deploy VLAN back segments? How do you deploy overlays? How do you do both at the same time? How do you migrate virtual machines sitting on this VDS back port group to an NSX VLAN back segment? Or how do you do all that type of stuff? We'll talk about migration strategies that you can do with all that type of stuff. This is stuff that I have on regular conversations with my clients on. We'll also take a look at layer 2 bridges and how you can do a bridge profile, how you can connect a overlay segment to a VLAN back segment and have VMs talking to each other that are in the same segment but not connected to the same port group, and all that good stuff that goes along with that. So there's going to be a lot of things we're going to be talking about and going through, because that's stuff that I had to deal with my customers in the real world. So that's basically how that goes in. So the first thing that you guys and I are going to go do is we're going to deploy, so the flow, as I should say, is I'm going to build this vSwitch, and that'll be the next video. I'm going to show you guys how to new vSwitch, new port group, and get it all set up the way that we need to. Then I'm going to deploy the domain controller. I'm going to walk you guys through how to do all of that stuff. Then once the domain controller is built, I'm going to show you guys how to deploy the CSR 1000Vs. I'll do one first, and then I'll do the other one on its own. Once they're deployed, and I'll talk you through the specifics of that. Once they're deployed, then we'll be able to start rolling out our ESXi hosts, get our storage online, all that type of stuff, and get that all rolled out. So it'll be a lot of repetitive stuff for me, but it'll show you guys basically how all this stuff comes into play. It's actually not that bad, but it's going to walk you guys through kind of in a sped up version of how, if I was going to do another data center deployment, this is how you would do it. So with that being said, if you guys have any questions, please leave a comment in the comment section below. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll catch all of you guys in the next video.